All right, welcome back to Sense Space. Today I've got two former guests and friends brought together for the first time, Liam Kavanagh and Matthew Green, and we are going to be jumping into the climate situation at hopefully deeper levels than we have before, with two people who bring a really unique perspective to it and are both actively engaged in the field in their own way. So I'm not going to be the expert in this conversation by any means. So I'm just really interested to learn from you both and throw in some questions and see how we can situate this conversation in a larger context and a living context that sort of embeds it beyond just the issue of climate change itself. So with that, want to invite you both to just give a little introduction, and perhaps just to kick off, we can consider in as succinct terms as we can what we're seeing the climate situation to be, and also how we want to engage in the conversation around that. That seems really important as well. At the outset of this conversation. So with that, hand it over to Liam or Matthew, and welcome again to the pod.
Matthew, you want to start?
Not really. I was hoping I might be able to riff off you, Liam.
Okay, that's fine.
Jacob just asked the biggest question on the planet. And
Yeah, exactly. Right. Where to start? I mean, I guess like maybe start off that everybody knows about it in some ways. I think Matthew and I are going to be part of the people, the group of people who's pretty forward around where we're at. That's really, what I'm doing right now in climate change is something called the Moderate Flank, which is a tentatively titled project. I mean, we're into it for a ways, but what we're really talking about is how do you get the majority of people involved in climate action? It probably isn't through direct action. It probably isn't through gluing themselves to motorways. Almost what we need is something like a climate mobilization that starts democratically, because the government's not doing it, right? And that there's not one big theory of change that we can give to people that says, that tells everyone this is what work there is for you to do. This is your job, right? It's a lot of different people have to find their work to do in a distributed fashion, because I mean, in the past with mobilizations like a government mobilization, say wartime, you have somebody who's at the top of a hierarchy who's handing out tasks to people, and somebody goes around like and you do this, you and you do that. That's not happening. It's really clear that's not going to happen anytime soon, and people are figuring out what's work is theirs to do, and part of the problem with the climate movement in general is that when you say, well, I want to work on climate, people say, well, you're going to save the world, come on, be realistic, right? If you say the same thing about organizing the world information as an individual, people will say that's ridiculous maybe as well. But if you're working for Google, people won't say that. They'll say, oh, well, Google together can actually do that. So it's not silly to me. But we're not seemingly able to achieve that in climate change, where there's kind of an overall credible democratic effort that makes people feel like they're part of, they have agency collectively, or they're part of something large enough, right? So then we have all sorts of issues if we don't have a kind of coherence between the people who are trying to do their own little thing. So we, Rupert Reed and I are working on this together. We started it. Now there's loads of other people who've joined. We're on our third gathering in March. One of the phrases that we all like very much is the next big thing is lots of little things. And what we're really looking to do is get the people who are doing their own humble little thing together in a coordinated fashion, to be, more than the whole is more than the sum of their parts. And I'm going to talk about more of that later, but I think that's probably like enough to start with.
Well, I love what you're saying, and I feel my whole system relaxing in a way, not because the problem has gone away and that it's now solved and that you've just unveiled the roadmap for doing that, but more because I feel like you're posing the right question. Like, my sense is that most people know that we have a major problem. And the response among a lot of people is, it's just too big. What can I do? And therefore they do nothing. Or, as you say, we find our own way to engage within the parameters of our lives. But there's something missing, isn't there? There's that broader sense that of some kind of collective intelligence or some kind of bottom-up response, some evolutionary pressure that is perhaps starting to awaken. And I see groups like Extinction Rebellion as a kind of eruption of that into the public eye. But I also think it's arising in many different ways, which are much harder to see, and certainly which the mainstream, well, let's say the legacy media, I prefer the legacy media term, and I've worked in the legacy media for many years, just isn't configured to see. It lacks it's like colorblind. It cannot see the colors that this is occurring in. So this change is just not available to be written about or covered or communicated in our kind of dominant news channels. So I want to dive in deeper and hear more about how this is, your impressions of that, like the moment we're in. We all feel it, like we're having this conversation because we feel it in our bodies that this is urgent and real. And even 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, it was much easier to live in denial. When the temperature's hitting 40 degrees and the local golf course is on fire, as it was last summer, then that gets a lot harder. And then something has to shift.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's probably a good point to start with, right? That, I mean, one of the things that we're saying, and I think why it's not like, oh, we're so brilliant. This is the time, that everything has a time, and I'm sure, and younger listeners, it's like, Matthew and I are of a certain age, where you wouldn't have been around in the 90s and the aughties having conversations with people in the kitchen asking, well, when are we actually going to do something about this? And, our generation was a bit like, well, unfortunately, we're going to do something when the crisis is too obvious to ignore. And then there'll be this critical mass, and that will act as kind of the coordination, this kind of, the people will coordinate when they look around and everybody else realizes, wow, we've got to do something. And then we'll get started too late, and we'll either, get it together really fast, and do enough or close to enough, to stop the worst, or we won't, right? And basically, in many ways, look, we're there now. That's basically what Matthew is just saying, that it's science, our degraded institutions, news institutions, and scientific institutions. We're not able to convince people to listen to them. People are starting to listen because of the weather, like felt experience proving, certain elements of the scientific and media institutions correct on this issue. People overall don't trust our institutions, and they're being, basically driven by the weather. And we have to take that into account as well. They're not going to then agree with everything those institutions say. Those institutions hemorrhage credibility for a reason, and we have to also account for that. Like, okay, it's. I think IPCC is pretty accurate personally. I think that they're they may be a little bit conservative in some ways. If anything, they're quite conservative in elements. They were late recognizing feedback effects, for example. So, but it's still hard to get people out of what we call soft denial, right? And so we face, still an issue of that institutionally, like, okay, the level of realization of the gravity of the issue is always going to lag, behind the actual gravity. So now people accept that it's an issue, but they don't realize, necessarily how much of an issue it is, because what we see is golf courses on fire, but we don't see, say, collapse of bread baskets or collapse of ecosystems yet, although the same scientific institutions that warned us that burning golf courses were inevitable are now warning us that those things are inevitable. So we basically have to get started as much as we can, and build credibility as much as we can. So this is part of the issue, is that we kind of, I think, need to, and I'm getting a little bit, I guess, high sense making level here, because I know that's your audience. I don't always talk this way to everybody about the moderate flank, right? But that, there's a cultural lesions that some people would talk about in kind of like teal culture, or conversations, or integral, or meta-modern conversations that we probably need to address as part of it as well. Like, how do we address the fact that basically our cultural divides that we're in right now prevent the kinds of people who've been advocating for climate change and climate mobilization from being fully listened to? How do we reach the rest of the population, and let them know that, no, this isn't, another thing that kind of science is telling you that might not be true. People look at neoliberal economics. Science said that was true. Now it says it isn't. Right? Scientists in 2008 were arguing that some of them, or not economists, many of them, if you took like polls of economists, thought that real estate prices were rational, or at least, large sections were arguing that, like surveys that, that people would say, well, it's not a bubble because markets are so perfect. And it wasn't widespread, as economists would like to claim now, that people were denouncing real estate prices. Nobody was talking about the fact that a financial collapse, I mean, some people were, but institutions weren't. Right. So if we're not owning up for the fact that actual information, infrastructure, this kind of conversation is broken, then we can't really address this, right? So that's an element of it, I think, that your readers, or your viewership rather, is probably going to be really interested in. And I think it's probably interesting to talk about with Matthew, is like the legacy media. Again, is, trust in the media is extremely low, right? So how do we deal with that, right? And I think that is really at the center of mobilizing the percentage of the population that we need for democratic action.
So,
Jacob.
just a couple of things coming for me, and then I'll hand over to you, Matthew. I guess in the first part of your really helpful introduction, Liam, the word that was popping out for me was emergence, as the way that this collective response is happening, and the connections are being made between the people that they need to be made between, and people finding what is their work to do. For some people that is going to be, for me, it feels like the work of more like philosophy and expressing myself as an artist gets me quite close to what feels like my work to do. It makes me feel alive. There's insight, there's flow there. And so those things can be indications that we're getting closer to actuating our human potential. And insofar as we're doing that, we may well be helpfully responding to this meta crisis of an issue. And with that, there was also a sense that there's a kind of, in spiritual psychedelic community context, there's this notion that there's a rise of the feminine going on during this time. I don't know if we want to get into that level. That's almost a mythic level of considering how we're relating to one another, ourselves, and the planet. I think there is a kind of as above, so below principle at work here, a macrocosm, microcosm principle in which finding right relationship, finding agency, finding sensitivity and interconnectedness in our local context is the way that we become capable of participating in the emergent webbing of the planet together that allows the response to happen and emerge. And then finally, another piece that you picked up on that felt really important to me is I've been following Jordan Peterson's kind of journey with this, and he's taken a very critical stance. He's very skeptical of the climate consensus. And I don't know quite where I stand with that. I feel climate change is happening. I have an embodied sense of ecological destruction, but I think there is a really important gem in there, and it's this concern about authoritarianism, centralization, top-down responses is a thread that's running through what he's articulating. And as you spoke to, this hemorrhaging of credibility in the institutions, and in science itself through the course of the COVID years, it raises legitimate concerns. And so I think if we only see the response possible as that, we need to be the ones that make the demands to the government and the big powers that be and the central authorities and get them to do it, and then them all top down come together and make a global governance structure and enforce and fix this thing. We have really good reasons to be concerned about that as well. And so it's really important that what you're articulating as the way that we respond to it is not that, it's something else. It's something that's also sensitive to the issue of authoritarian panic and getting into that kind of war mode. So I know I've thrown out a lot there. I'm happy for you also to pick up that thread about media as well, Matthew. But yeah, feel free to run with it wherever you wish.
Yeah, well, there's lots of things that you spoke about which are very deep or rich topics. The one I'll maybe attempt to develop right now is this connection you made between, or this idea that our relationality or the way we're showing up in our daily lives, in our relationships, in our work, is very integral to what the ultimate response will look like. That there's a connection, as you say, it's not just about getting governments to do something. And we've been trying that for 30 years, right? And that has had limited impact. But the exciting part of this for me is the idea that suddenly we see all these connections. Like I might see that I'm depressed, and I might start to see that my depression is related to the kind of working environment I'm in. And I might see that that working environment is itself a reflection of a bigger system and a bigger system, which is also the system that's creating the climate crisis. And we may go deeper and look at the origins of that system in hundreds of years of colonialism and imperialism. And we suddenly start to awaken to a very different perspective, not just on the whole world, but on our own most intimate struggles. And I think that for me, although that at one level could sound like something very overwhelming, on the other hand, it feels to me like something very empowering, because ultimately people care individually about how they feel and what's going on in their immediate environment. But when we start to understand that this is all fractals, and that the way that we relate to ourselves, even internally, is then reflected in how we treat other people and the kinds of compromises we make and the systems we participate in. Suddenly our whole identity can start to shift. And I think it was Liam, you used the word agency. We realize maybe that we have far more agency than we thought. And even more, we actually realized we weren't even who we thought we were. Like our whole sense of who and what we are begins to undergo a radical shift. And that, for me, is what's going to have to happen, and it is starting to happen on a global scale, if we're going to make the shift, the transition in a way that is going to bring us to a breakthrough, rather than just this collapsed trajectory that all the data tells us we're on. But at the same time, that can sound very abstract or very even idealistic. And yet I just feel like that is what it will be. It will be something that changes what it is to be human, as much as it is going to be about policies or finance or government. It's that as well, but it's something much, much bigger that is bubbling under the surface and ready to come through.
Yeah. Right. So that's, and this is kind of one of these interesting ways, like, how do we navigate that? Because so for a lot of people, they haven't started looking at that yet. They aren't looking at the collapse trajectory. And then there's this process of, well, okay, we have to do something about climate change. And when you realize just how severe it is, a lot of people think, oh, if it was really severe, then something would have been done about it, right? And then they start asking, okay, it is really severe, and yet nothing's been done about it. And then the question really, people start to really people experience this over and over again, looking at the system more broadly, and they start seeing some of the things that you're talking about. But everybody is on a different stage of that inquiry, and they're coming at it from different angles with different assumptions. So we have this kind of question of how to organize so many different people who have a dawning realization of the severity of the issue, but who are on really different points of, coming from very different places on different trajectories. So how do you coordinate those people, or how do they work on at least that issue of climate change? I think this is one of the most delicate things, because the people who already feel like they have an answer, or they see the big picture, can have a kind of a quite certain answer, right? So we have to basically find this way of working together on what we can agree on, while having an active process where we get further into the issues we don't yet agree on. And I think that's possibly one of the most politically fraught dynamics in the climate change sector, right? So like, it comes into social justice a lot. It comes into everything, biodiversity. Because once you start realizing, looking at the larger system, you realize, like, well, it's not just climate change. We have a worse biodiversity crisis, or equally bad biodiversity crisis, following right on the heels of climate change. That switching to electric cars isn't going to do anything about that. And we have massive inequality, and that neither of those, that a response to either of those problems doesn't necessarily have to address, but the kind of economic systems that we have are going to create more problems. These are just two problems, that are, it's like the first potentially fatal syndromes to develop out of a deeply unhealthy way of living, right?
Yeah. Symptoms, basically.
Yeah. You could say, like, I would say, like, it's a bit like smoking. You could get emphysema, or you could get cancer that would kill you.
Yeah.
But ultimately, there's something that you're doing that is going to do you in eventually. And we haven't really come to the place that actually the way that our economic system is going to do us in, eventually.
It's something about kind of addiction, something about the state of addiction that sounds like what you're expressing is how we relate to these unhealthy, unwholesome, fragmentary kind of ways of working, being, even relating to knowledge. And just as you say about smoking, I mean, I don't know, this might be too far out for you all, but for me, I look to see and experience this phenomena of the climate crisis in my immediate local context. I'm looking to see where I can directly sense it. And so when I look around, I look at little microcosms, things like the issue of litter, to me, are profoundly meaningful representations of the problem at large. What is the sense of separation that one has and the lack of regard that causes you to discard something that is plastic just onto the street? And what is the shift in consciousness that one undergoes to extend that awareness or extend that sense of responsibility a bit larger than oneself, to see oneself as connected with that? And things like our relationship to drugs and alcohol, the widespread use of tobacco and nicotine in addictive ways, not necessarily just the chemicals, but the widespread addictive use of vaping, for example. To me, that's sort of like a pacifier or some sort of comfort support things. There are all these little things that you can begin to tune in and notice that are indicative of, symptomatic of that underlying condition of lack of wholesomeness, of the underlying human needs not being met, and consequently a lack of sensitivity to place and environment. And then you get a kind of social field produced by all those individuals that is also kind of fragmented or slightly disassociative. And so when Matthew's talking about this new way of being with one another, this new way of relationship, that's not some esoteric, fanciful thing of wouldn't it all be great if we could also have community with our climate change eco movement. It's that community and relationship and dialogue are the fundamental fabric of relationship that binds us all together in our hearts, souls, our capacity to think and make sense. All of it is in this fabric. So if we can work on that fabric, if we can be together in a different way into being, I know Liam's done plenty on that and I've been glad to participate with, that's important too. And so it's a multifaceted, interconnected issue, and we are multifaceted, interconnected beings when we're relating to it well.
One thing I just have to run really quickly because there's somebody hitting the doorbell. Can I?
Yes. Would you like us to? Should we pause? I can edit the recording, or should we roll on?
Right.
Pause.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry about that.
Cool. I just want to share with you this very psychedelic guitar that my sister-in-law painted for me.
That's wow. Cool. That's awesome.
Yeah, it's been a fucking great gift. I just sit and look at it. We had a kind of live thread going. I don't know if either of you are still holding one of the threads and would like to pull on it.
Yeah, well, you were talking about community and sort of this recovery of community, right? So I guess, and this is the issue with climate change, right? It's that, and I think in this space is that we can, because it is the symptom for this issue, right? It's a way of like looking at also okay. Like the first potentially fatal symptom of a very deep issue. And I think it's a great way to recognize it. But the other thing is, I'm an unashamed pragmatist in that, like, if you read Noam Chomsky, for example, you know, a lot of people know who he is. He wrote a book a couple of years ago, and he essentially said, we don't have time for a cultural, you know, revolution. I don't think we're going to get anarcho-capitalism, his, you know, his favored way of organizing the world. We're not going to get that into action on the time scale. We need to address climate change. And he's, you know, arguing for sort of this large technical solution to it, using a lot of, you know, the tools that we have available in terms of large government. I'm not saying that's what we should do, but we kind of have to be open to everything now, and also really being aware of the fact that whatever we end up doing now, it isn't going to solve the what's at the depths of this, right? We're probably going to end up kind of treating the symptom to some degree, and at the same time we have to be addressing the syndrome, but it may take us longer to address the way of being at the root of the symptom than it takes us to put a patch on the symptom, right? Which is often the case in kind of medicine. You know, so we may need to do both of those things, not community, not fixing the great separation or anything. You know, it's not ignoring that, but it's also realizing that the speed of, you know, some of us, if there's a version of you know, letting the perfect being the enemy of the good, where we want collective enlightenment as part of, we want, you know, climate awareness to give us collective enlightenment. And, you know, that may not be true either, right? Maybe it will, but we don't want to be attached to it. We all know, like, being attached to enlightenment is the surest way not to get enlightened. It's not any different, I think, with collective transformation, right? So we have to be ready to work with anybody, wherever they are. Kind of quite practical issue, I think.
Yeah, I'm not, I'm struggling to articulate maybe what it is that I'm driving at in a way that doesn't sound like I'm waiting for universal enlightenment to break out, even though I am waiting for that to break out. And I'm hoping that it will come, like, hopefully by the end of the week. Yeah, I guess, though, I guess my perspective has been shaped by some of the spaces I've been in very specifically in the last year. You know, I've been working on this collective trauma work with Thomas Hubel, very involved with that, doing in-person retreats, weekend retreats. I've just done one over last weekend. And it's such a, for me, although I've been on a path of inner work for a long time, seeing what can happen at scale when you have hundreds of people engaged in a very skillfully facilitated, well-held container all over the world. We have people from the Europe to the US, South America, Africa, China. There feels something so alive and real and transformational and intelligent that is going on, that I can feel moving through my system and feel moving through the whole, this kind of micro community. It feels to me like that has to, like, not that specifically, but that principle, that sense of collective agency, of stepping out of our usual ego dictated identities and conditioning, recognizing how trauma is getting in our way, both individually and collectively. I mean, it just feels like building a bridge between that very real, exciting energy and unfolding realization and this hyper object of climate change. It just, Jacob, you talked about your role as a philosopher, an artist, and general raconteur. like in my mind, a networker, you're bringing people together, and I'm in awe of the level you're so articulate that I almost hesitate to follow you sometimes. So I'm in awe of what you're bringing in that domain. But I feel like in my case, it's something around, like, we're all living in this trauma matrix without even realizing it. And many of us, and I think an increasing exponential wave of us, are starting to kind of get that in different ways. And maybe this is what the inner work meeting in Liverpool you mentioned is about, and finding ways to articulate that and make that into something that people can recognize and participate in whatever way is appropriate for them. But that is like consciousness movement. I mean, that's not the right term, but there's something, right? Mm-hmm. It's like people have talked about the environmental movement being the biggest global movement that's invisible. So many, RSPB has what, over 1 million members in the UK. The Conservative Party has 80,000. And there's something similar around this conversation around just shaking off the accumulated layers of centuries and centuries of, I'm going to have to go there, Jacob, what Terence McKenna would have called dominator culture, right? I mean, this is what Black Lives Matter is about in some sense. It's what other conversations about sexuality are about, and all kinds of other domains. But there's something that's kind of shaking and saying, we need an update. We need an update for the system. What we've been doing is about to crash. But look at all these new updates that are coming in if we're receptive to receiving them.
One piece I want to add here is the sense of, there is a sense that undergoing that kind of work, undergoing that kind of journey, which I think is available to everyone at the possibility of a journey of knowing yourself more deeply, of healing, is available to everyone in different ways at different stages. And that's not just good for itself and bloody difficult and filled with ups and downs. That to me is also something that enables that shaking off that you're talking about, that removing of obstacles to the natural flow of life through yourself and in relation to other people. That's enabling of a capacity to express, communicate, emote, connect, listen, understand, and so on. That, like, those qualities, those very human virtues, and create more than human people. And those capacities, I think, will be enabling of the kind of soul force that's necessary to cut through the thing that, for God's sake, you keep trying to cut through and it's not working. What is the rapturous energy? We always talk about Martin Luther King, and I love listening to some of his speeches. That kind of living fire, that living water that was flowing through him, was really important to catalyzing that movement. And there were probably a ton of movers and shakers and people who ticked boxes and did lists and signed petitions and organized and all of that stuff. But the animating soul of the movement was a real part of it and a uniting part of it. So just wanted to include that as well.
Yeah, well, I guess it's interesting, right? Because I'm struggling in a way, because I think what I said was that we want to go there, but we're probably not going to go there on the same time scale as climate change. And it seems to be heard as that's not necessary, right? Like, I'm saying that is probably necessary to address the real root of what's underneath here, right? Until we have a cultural kind of change, deep-rooted, we're not safe. But it doesn't have to be climate change. We may be able to address climate change before that overall change happens, right? and part of where we can come up with problems, and part of where we can in some way fail, is not being pragmatic and getting it's kind of attached to the idea of a global justice, that precedes climate change, for example, right? Like, it's not clear necessarily. Maybe we can do it, and there's no reason to like not try, but there's a difference between trying to have global justice and needing to have global justice before we address climate change. Like, we address all sorts of less deep, less severe problems than climate change without global justice writ large, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we want, eventually we want to get there, and hopefully as quickly as possible. And I hope this is a trigger for the types of inquiry. And I think it is. I mean, I think it's pretty clear from people like Joanna Macy, her work, all of these kind of the spread in integral movements in what's called, metamodernism, this kind of new paradigm awakening that's going on. It's clear climate change is a trigger, right? But the question is it going to be complete by the time we start really addressing climate change on like an institutional level? And part of the reason I would say, just if we're just putting on our rational hat for a minute and saying, well, maybe not. And so just think about Joanna Macy, what she was trying to do in the 80s. She was trying to get people to connect to all life on Earth, right? Because at that point, people, in order to start doing something about climate change, people were, sometimes really genuinely talking about polar bears. Now we're talking to 18-year-olds, and it's their own future, right? Like, they don't have to have an expanded circle of empathy as we needed, right? The person who needs to do something on climate change does not need to have this radically expansive circle of empathy that they needed in the 80s in order to be motivated. People literally need to worry about their own skin in order for movement to start. And that doesn't mean that we can be satisfied, because again, future generations are still imperiled. If we put some patch on the system that created this, we're going to have, something else is going to come down the line that has exactly the same characteristics, and that's going to, eventually one's going to come up that we can't deal with, right? And so, I think it's both these things of being pragmatic in terms of the, what we can do now, where people are at, and also doing whatever we can to drive to cultivate this cultural transformation. And those things can be working together very, closely, right? And this is the thing as well, Mandela and King were also political pragmatists, they're very like spiritually aware, but they're also quite pragmatic, very idealistic and very pragmatic at the same time, right? Those don't have to be in oppositions, right? You can have great ideals and realize, like we do in spiritual traditions, that most Christians don't live up to the ideals of, are not Christ-like on a moment-to-moment basis. It doesn't make them hypocrites because they're not Christ-like, right? The same is true with every other of the world's major wisdom traditions. Like, most people don't live up with the ideals. So we don't need to surrender ideals to kind of get through the day. We don't need to, kind of dismiss anything because it doesn't live up to the ideals. We just need to keep the ideals close to our hearts, right? Not surrender them at any point.
I really appreciate this way you're articulating the pragmatism. I just want to hone in a little bit on the sense. I mean, you've talked to me before about like reaching the people who are partners in the law firms and the finance firms who are also concerned about this issue and who aren't necessarily going to be resonating on the frequency that Matthew and I were kind of speaking to there. and it's essential that we do that. So is it the case that what you're doing with this deep pragmatism and with the moderate flank is in some sense about finding a pan-political, or somehow breaking free of the association of climate with green and left and all of those things that have bound it and sort of drawn it down into one side of the political sphere, and then make it into like, what's the quality of that, where we're open to everything and we're engaging everywhere at once?
Yeah, I mean, so you can't divorce it from every aspect of, so for example, like what's the minimal kind of assumptions we need to have to start addressing climate change? Okay, market fundamentalism, the very least. Market fundamentalism, at the very least, has to go, right? Your Jordan Peterson point. I mean, I don't know, like Jordan Peterson, part of his criticisms of climate change is essentially, back when he held up the example of this Dutch teenager who was going to invent a robot who was going to remove garbage from the oceans as an example of what people should be doing instead of climate activism, right? Like, it was idea, this is the capitalist ideal. The market always invents the solution to problems. Somebody's going to remove carbon from the atmosphere by a super cheap process and then sell it, find a way to turn it into something saleable. And a clever capitalist will just figure this all out, by themselves, like, or Elon Musk or whatever, right? That is just clearly not true, right? We've gotten, a couple of years later, the Dutch teenagers, plastic removal scheme. You haven't heard anything about it. There's a reason for that. The right-wing press would be telling you about it if it had cleaned the world's oceans. It hasn't. There's no reason to believe that we're going to produce clean energy more cheaply than dirty energy on the time scale that we need to decarbonize, right? And realizing, like, mainstream economics has recognized for a very long time that markets fail, right? And so we're going to have to realize that, yeah, just like laissez-faire economics does not give the answers. That's a challenge for some people. So on, libertarian right, there is some things that are inherently, you can't make it apolitical, but you have to kind of ask, like, okay, what is the group of people, the majority that we need? How big of an umbrella can we make to get all of those people under one, in discussion to do something now? How do we get inquiries started around what are really at the roots of this? What's really at the roots of this? Not having to say it needs to be this. We need to have this massive transformation, but we need to accept the fact that there is, a threat, an existential threat to our civilization, our children's lives, and have the inquiry starting from there, and let it lead us to, in the short term, a pragmatic solution in climate change that may be pretty ugly, and in the long term, not just be satisfied with a patch, because we know what's going to happen if we declare victory after we patch climate change and then go home.
Matthew, I know at DSMOGD, as a journalist, part of what you're doing is kind of holding to account or probing into the sort of the dirty laundry of companies and people who are on the wrong side of this issue. So I wonder if, like, how, and this is kind of perhaps a new terrain, but like, what's the sort of meeting point there between the pragmatic reaching out the hand, connecting with everyone and anyone that you can get the conversation with, and also this kind of on the attack, on the lookout, and holding to account and shaming or lambasting or exposing. I don't want to completely, like, there's a real valid essential element to this journalistic approach to it, but I wonder if there's somehow a meeting point in that's emerging.
That's exactly the question I'm walking, and I don't have an answer to it. And at times, these two activities or approaches can seem like they're operating on different planes, and finding a way to integrate them together, I think, is the question that I'm working with. On one analysis, and I think it's a pretty compelling analysis, a big part of the reason that we're in the crisis we're in now is because very powerful companies and bought enough influence in the US and elsewhere to make sure there was no reasonable prospect of us taking action when it would have been most logical to do so, i.e. 30 years ago, right? So there is a whole, and a lot of people still don't kind of understand that. It's still not, like, even working in somewhere like a big media organization. I was climate correspondent at Reuters. People didn't kind of get that at one level, it is a fight. It is a fight between the incumbents who are benefiting from the status quo and essentially want to continue the status quo as long as possible, regardless of the damage to the planet and the people living on it, and the disruptors, who are in many different forms, under many different flags, as it were, but who are all working on some kind of, that is a straight up fight: power, money, influence. And obviously the incumbents have a big home advantage in that fight. And that seems obvious to me. It's obvious to anyone who's really spent any time engaging on climate change at all, that the reason that we're in the predicament we're in is because of these interests. But even in like 2020, 21, even now, if you say that at somewhere like Reuters, they will say you're an activist. So I'm not an activist. I'm just pointing to the problem. It's still not an understanding that has really dropped in. A lot of the media still thinks of climate coverage basically as a science story. That's starting to change now. But for a long time, it wasn't literally about polar bears. And that conversation about systemic change and the roots of the crisis is still, where do you find that conversation in the legacy media? It's kind of there, it's percolating, but there's no like structural shift to recognize that this is the story we're reporting on, that I've seen, really. So that's why I went to DSMOG, because I thought, in that question of what do I bring, what do I do, and we're asking ourselves that question, the skill set that I have is journalism, the background I have. Where do I apply that? Well, I think we should be, for sure, illuminating how these interests operate, how they influence policymakers, how they actively undermine the kind of change that Moderate Flank and others are calling for. We need to illuminate that to inform effective mobilization and activism, definitely. But it's definitely not enough either, because the word that I've been holding after a conversation with Karen O'Brien, I'm sure, Liam, you're familiar with Karen O'Brien's work on quantum social change. She talks about building a non-polarizing social movement. What is it? DSMOG, it's pretty polarized, right? We're there to point out bad actors and what they're doing, but that isn't enough even in and of itself. It's an essential component, but it can only be part of this bigger ecosystem ultimately. And I still don't know what that looks like. How it was Gail Bradbrook in another conversation who was saying, we can't defeat, what was it, a dominator system with dominator tactics. And what are the alternative effective tactics look like? And I guess that's the question, Liam, you're walking, right?
Yeah.
Or one of them.
Yeah. I mean, so our first, practice is, right, respect everybody. We have kind of interpersonal practices, right? And this is the thing. If you think about like Martin Luther King, we went back to, Jacob mentioned it before. I just watched the mountaintop speech, his last one ever, over and over and over again. There is nothing polite about that speech, right? He's not sugarcoating anything, right? And this is the thing, is that there is something about that he demonstrates that it is possible to point out a history of oppression, a history of broken promises, a history of hypocrisy, without being disrespectful or hateful, right? And I think that's part of the good thing about podcasts, is that in an in-person form, in print, when we don't have a tone of voice and a picture, it's really hard to get that across. But when we communicate with, our vitality forms, as some people like to say in science, kind of present, and people really see where we're coming from emotionally, it's possible for that to come across and realize, yeah, we actually don't need to hate polluters. I don't need to hate oil executives because they're lying, or because they have undertaken, actually activities that are going to be responsible for loads of people dying. I don't need to hate them because they do that. I do feel morally compelled to be really honest with them and say that their behavior is, to me, unacceptable, and we have to correct it. And you don't have to hate people to send them to jail. You just have to realize that, look, there has to be consequences if things don't work, right? And certain people are dangerous, and they have to be kept out of the way of other people, right? There's all sorts of, if you talk to jail wardens, they're responsible for keeping people in bars. Some of them don't hate prisoners at all. There's some very kind jail wardens, right? There's also a lot of injustice in the criminal, justice system. There's a lot of people who don't belong behind bars. I'm not trying to say the criminal justice system is perfect, but right, even a well-functioning criminal justice system would have people in it behind bars, and we wouldn't need to hate anybody to have, a criminal justice system that works, but we would still probably have people in prison, right? I think most people would agree with that, and no one would need to hate anybody, but some people would be behind bars, right? Even in a perfectly ideal, totally, perfectly Christian, perfectly Buddhist, perfectly whatever type of, moral, code or aspiration you want to ascribe to, and meeting that perfectly, we have sanctions, right? And I think that's something we don't, a point of moral acceptance and this kind of spiritual acceptance, that we accept the being for its existence, for what it is, but that doesn't mean we need to approve of behavior. You can disapprove of people's behavior, and still accept exactly who they are, right? It just means that, who they are may belong in jail. That's just the way things are sometimes,
Yeah, it brings me in mind of the distinction between justice and judgment. Like, we can serve justice, but judgment has a different feel to it. And it's a dilemma in activist circles, though, right? In that it's very easy to project, and it's very easy for people who are carrying, like we all do, different kinds of wounds and trauma, and actually to be very much driven and motivated by that material, and to bring that into the situation that they're trying to change, which isn't always an effective means, can be a powerful motivator. But actually, to meet this system, this, I guess Thomas Hübl would call it, this trauma architecture, which is so frozen. Just like if you're speaking to a client as a trauma therapist, if you go straight to the jugular of the issue, they will lock down and either dissociate or leave the session or some other defense mechanism will kick into place. And it's a little bit like that, perhaps at the systemic level. You have this traumatized system that we live in, right? Which is full of its own unresolved trauma, perpetrator trauma, going back generations on the level of the state. And then you challenge that system. How do you do it in such a way that you can find the way in, that you can find the way to kind of liquefy those layers that are keeping these destructive, exploitative practices in place? And to put it in very concrete terms, look at where we are in the UK. We've had waves of civil resistance, XR, Insulate Britain, Just Stop Oil, and the state now has brought in incredibly draconian legislation to crack down on protests. More and more protesters are going to jail, even though they're very small numbers relative to the size of the population, but they are going to jail now. And they're opening up new oil licenses in the North Sea and a new coal mine. Like, not to say that those movements have failed, because I don't think they have failed. And it's difficult to understand all of the many avenues of consequence that they've set in motion. But we can see that hardening. How to get around that? How to short circuit that? What is the form of engagement that helps to shift that or resolve that tension?
There's a lot of, well, on the protest point, right? I think, I mean, I think it's a lot of it though is really just standing up for basic principles, like, protest rights, right? That getting rid of protest, responding to, I think we need two things, right? Like, there's this kind of like trauma that's coming up, and I agree with you, right? This is why we call it the moderate flank, right? In a lot of ways, right? The idea is that you have, like, if you have this trauma energy, it does move the Overton window, right? People are kind of afraid of kind of the activism that comes from anger, and anger comes from somewhere. Like that's not, we don't need to dismiss the anger, right? The anger of that many people, there's a reason for it, right? I may not share their particular forms of activism always. I don't condemn them all either, but it does come from somewhere, and maybe I might choose to or aspire to behave differently. I don't want to pretend that I'm always king-like either, but we can offer another bridge, right, where the moderate flank, if you look at the classic opposition is Malcolm X versus Martin Luther King. Malcolm X was a lot angrier individual. There was a lot more separation between him and the people that he was accusing. So he was telling white America, about what it was really like, as opposed to its promises as well, right? But there's a lot more anger, and really emotionally, maybe the most important part of this, right, is that Malcolm X really obviously at that time did not have a lot of time for white people. He openly hated white people really for a large part of his life. He had a transformation later on, and King had a quite different approach, and was always trying to find a way not to hate quite successfully, I think. And King was I think successful in connecting with people, right, and sort of building this bridge and allowing people to really hear the criticisms without feeling fundamentally like rejected as a human being, but really think, you're behaving really badly, but there's still kind of space for some type of there's space for peace, there's space for reconciliation, emotional space for emotional connection, right? And I think that's part of moderate being what we're really going for with a moderate flank. We need a new, we're looking for a better name. It's very difficult. Climate change is a bit like a rock band. All the names are taken, right? So maybe we'll end up being the Flaming Climate Lips or something like that. But that there's that I think is really the difficult bit, right? And this gets into the real issue in many ways is this inner issue. It's how to be totally blunt without being hateful. What I'd like to point out is that diplomats are great at this. It's not just, you don't have to be just spiritual. Hostage negotiators are great at this. Business people are great at it, right? If you actually talk to hostage negotiators and listen to them, they say, well, I have empathy for the people that I'm negotiating with. They really try to see their side of the issue. I mean, they may, at the same time, if a sniper has a clear shot, they might tell them to take it, right? It's not this, just because you disagree, and I probably shouldn't say that because people are going to interpret it as we want to kill, whatever climate deniers. I don't, want to kill anybody. I don't think that's going to help in this case. But my point is that you don't have to be in favor of being nice to somebody or, having kid gloves on to, empathize with them, to see to emotionally connect. People who are negotiating with Putin, if they're doing it effectively right now, probably are emotionally connecting with him. I would prefer that our diplomats in some ways are, emotionally connected to Putin. They're probably more effective that way. They probably also would be really glad if they heard that he was deposed tomorrow. There's not as, we think there's a contradiction there, but I think that's mainly because people live in, most of us avoid that kind of conflict because it's challenging. But in this case, we can't avoid it, right? There's a lot of stuff going on that isn't very nice, and we aren't going to address it by hating the people doing it.
No, I'm really appreciating where we've gotten to here with this really tactile, not easily definable, but very apparent sense of somehow being receptive, vulnerable, connecting, whilst also being deeply rooted in some sort of principle or kind of truth that is affording of the willingness to conflict and the willingness to not give ground, but also the pragmatism to give ground when needed to as well. And so, I'm really so far just coming away with I feel sort of more tuned in to how I would like to be relationally beyond the climate issue, to be honest. But it's and that's not an aside as well. The other thing that's been going on in the back of my mind listening to you both is the sheer amount of parallels on this issue to the COVID issue and the massive amount of separation and conflict and demands to put these people in jail or these people in jail and so on and so forth, and the sheer difficulty we face to actually bring the reconciliation and holds to account between the differing sides on that. So it's it speaks again to that degree to which what we're addressing, the proper comporting of ourselves, the proper positioning, the posture that we take in relation to climate change is somehow that which will afford us to relate well with a whole range of other important things in the big sphere and in the local sphere.
I love what you said, Jacob and Liam. I feel really connected with both of you and very reassured by the wisdom that I'm hearing. It's just presence of wisdom, which I don't always possess very effectively. But what's coming to me is just wanting to presence evil and recognize that there is evil in the world, and that evil is something we have to contend with as well. And I also agree that we cannot, in a sense, become what we're fighting against or opposing. But I do feel that at the very core of all of this is just proper, eternal, old-fashioned evil, and having a clear-eyed look at that, and how that then, what that demands of us, but also what that can potentially do to us as actors in this as well, is important. And I don't even know how I would even unpack that, but it just feels like there are some people who really don't care. There are sociopaths at the top of some of these organizations and governments who just don't care in the way that we do. And I agree, we falling into hatred or prejudice is unhelpful. That's not the energy that those of us who care about the climate and all the associated issues should fall into. And yet, I gotta say, we're facing like real evil as well.
Yeah, you know, I always think about it like it's kind of, people might find it like a silly thought exercise, but just think about growing a house cat to 10 times its size. It'd probably kill you, right? Like cats just kind of kill things that they're able to kill, you know, quite easily. Most house cats, if they were the size of a, you know, tiger, they're kind of bred to be killers. You know, they come up and cuddle up to you, but you know, they'd probably, you know, kill you if they were so large they didn't have to worry about the consequences if you were sort of rodent size, you know, in relation to them. Yet somehow we do love them because they're not a threat to us. But if you kind of take that view of like, oh, well, it's in the nature of a sociopath to be the way that they are. You know, I don't need to hate them to realize they don't belong in positions of power. And again, they may very well belong in jail, right? But it is like, I do find it the most frustrating part of the spiritual space. Like I've dealt with some stuff very recently where I'm kind of trying to get colleagues to realize that, like, I think this person's just fundamentally duplicitous that we're dealing with, right? And
For real.
yeah. I mean, people it's very spiritual and sometimes, you know, think they have to think the best of people.
No, that's the biggest pitfall to fall into. I absolutely agree. You have to be realistic about personality structures and clusters of personality traits and how they show up in people. And we can recognize often that trauma is at the root of that. And we can have compassion for the trauma that shaped that personality structure. But to be naive in recognizing the patterns that are at work will fail. Actually, we need to get really smart about recognizing those traits and behaviors because they're actually pretty widespread, and they're certainly pretty widespread at the top of the organizations and companies that are at the heart of all of this question.
Yeah, very powerful in 20th century history, including in our own government. You know?
And watching it within us as well. It's always monitoring for how those traits have their own seed in us. But I agree, like the idea that we just have to be really nice is not gonna get us out of this mess. It's about being really clear and really boundary and strong. We need to be warriors, but in the kind of highest octave, the highest iteration. We're committed to justice rather than judgment and discernment and spotting, you know, that wetico, right? That's that consciousness that it's like, I can sometimes feel it. I've got a bit on me, like, oh no. And then I can see there's a lot over there, but it's everywhere. Like, and it's having that ability to kind of be awake to that and work around it and be really skilled in dancing with it.
Yeah, 100%. need to be very awake to it. And I think dealing with something like Vladimir Putin, Russian militaristic, traditional masculine aggression, like there's a necessary to be clear-eyed and confronting in relation to that, and all the myriad forms that it takes. And so what I'm hearing in this is somehow, a synthesis of the feminine and the masculine together being somehow necessary, and not just more of the feminine, but the masculine, and indeed the masculine shadow, because ultimately what I'm finding in myself is, whilst it's bloody difficult and terrible, there's also creative energy and power in that eventually integrated shadow part of self. And that's the same part that gives the capacity and courage and clear-eyedness to face the motherfucker sort of energy as we encounter it manifest in the world. And boy, there's some motherfuckers out there, and they may be wounded children inside, but they're very dangerous people on the outside, and they're not your friends, and they're not necessarily playing in the same rule book that you're playing in. And if you're not awake to that, then boy, you're in trouble. So I really feel enriched by this conversation. And as we're getting to our wrap up time, just to appreciate so much of what's been brought in and explored, and the vitality and the groundedness at the same time that I'm feeling alchemically coming between you. And also I think it's testament to my own belief in following my heart and my intuition to bring you two together, and that is fulfilled in a meaningful conversation such as this is a good sign that that's the right kind of thing to do. So with that, thank you very much. And any sort of closing remarks or things you didn't get to say? Otherwise, yeah, it's been great to do this.
Just thank you a lot, Jacob, for setting this up, and thank you, Matthew. It was really a pleasure to meet you and to talk about this. Yeah, I think we got somewhere, and I really feel like the same way, kind of got very connected and inspired.
Yeah, likewise, Liam. Thank you. It's really a pleasure to meet you, and I hope we'll have a chance to collaborate more closely going forward. I'm sure we'll have future conversations. And Jacob, really saluting your weaving and facilitation skills. And I haven't known you very long, but I've been just blown away by the contribution you're making, and the perspective you bring, and the way you're finding your own unique signature in all of this at this time. So thank you. And yeah, look forward to the next dialogue.
Thank you, Matthew. It means a lot to hear that. So thank you both, and thank you everyone who listens along, and looking forward to further dialogues.
Yeah.